The Stellar Combat Academy of Zarian 9 had seen thousands of cadets pass through its gleaming corridors, but none quite like Raya Chen. She stood barely 5 feet tall, with arms that looked like they'd struggled to lift a standard-issue pulse rifle. The other cadets towering Krellians with their forearms, crystalline Vextari with bodies harder than diamond, and even her fellow humans who'd been gene-modded for combat all watched her with barely concealed amusement. Another baseline human, muttered Crow Commander Zax, his mandibles clicking in what passed for laughter among his kind. The Academy's standards must be slipping. Raya ignored him, as she'd learned to ignore most comments about her appearance. She'd heard it all before. Too small, too weak, too human. Not the augmented, enhanced humans that now made up most of Earth's military forces, but an original, what they called a baseline, with almost contemptuous pity. Ellis Hawthorne, her assigned partner for the term, seemed equally unimpressed when they first met. He was everything she wasn't, tall, gene-enhanced with the perfect proportions that military augmentation provided. His handshake was perfunctory, his smile polite but distant. "Try to keep up," he said, not unkindly, but with the assurance of someone who'd never had to struggle for anything physical in his life. The Academy's training was brutal by design. It had to be. The Galactic Coalition faced threats that required the best warriors from 100 worlds. Raya failed the strength tests. She barely passed the endurance runs. In zero-gravity combat, she was consistently last in her class. "Why are you even here?" asked Valandra, a Vextari whose body could withstand the pressure of a gas giant's atmosphere. It wasn't cruelty in her crystalline voice, just genuine confusion. "Your species has augmentation technology. Why come here, like that?" Raya's jaw tightened. "Because someone has to remember what we were." The answer made no sense to anyone, including Ellis, who'd begun to show hints of actual concern for his struggling partner. He started staying after training sessions, showing her techniques, trying to help her compensate for what everyone assumed were crippling physical limitations. "You're not bad at the theory," he offered one evening, as she failed yet again to complete the obstacle course in the required time. "Maybe you could transfer to Strategy Division." "No," Raya said simply, her dark eyes fixed on the course ahead. "I'm here for weapons mastery." Ellis didn't laugh. He wanted to, but something in her tone stopped him. The rumors started 3 weeks before graduation trials. The Academy, in its infinite wisdom and tradition, had arranged for the Blade of Zarian to be displayed in the Great Hall. It was a relic from the planet's ancient past, before the Zeri had evolved beyond physical forms into their current energy-based existence. The weapon was 15 feet of folded dark matter, contained in a crystalline matrix that made it theoretically liftable, but only theoretically. The blade was famous across the galaxy. Gravity-locked, it reportedly weighed as much as a small starship. Dozens of species' strongest warriors had tried to lift it over the centuries. All had failed. It had become a rite of passage, a way for cadets to test themselves against the impossible. Krell Commander Zaxter attempted it first, all 4 of his massive arms straining. The blade didn't budge. Valandra tried, her crystalline body creaking with effort. Nothing. Even the Academy's instructors had tried over the years. The blade remained unmoved, a monument to limitation. "Humans shouldn't even attempt it," Zaxter announced after his failure, "even the augmented ones. Your species lacks the necessary density." Raya had been quiet all evening, watching from the back of the crowd. Ellis stood beside her, having given up his own attempt after barely making the blade shift a millimeter. "You're not thinking about it," Ellis said, reading her expression. "Why not?" Raya replied. "Raya, I'm gene-modded with enhanced musculature, and I could barely make it move." "You can't even," he stopped, realizing how it sounded. "Can't even pass basic strength requirements," she finished for him. "I know," but she was already walking forward, her small frame somehow commanding attention as she moved through the crowd. The hall fell silent, not with anticipation, but with the uncomfortable quiet that comes before an embarrassing failure. Raya stood before the blade, barely tall enough to reach its grip comfortably. Her arms, which the Academy had mocked for months, looked impossibly fragile next to the massive weapon. "This is painful to watch," someone muttered. Ellis wanted to stop her to save her from the humiliation, but something made him stay silent. Perhaps it was the memory of her words. "Someone has to remember what we were." Raya's hands closed around the blade's grip. She didn't strain immediately, didn't throw her weight into it like the others had. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and measured. "She's meditating." Zaxter's confusion was evident. "This isn't a spiritual." The blade moved. Not a millimeter, not an inch. Raya lifted the blade of Zarian clear off its pedestal. raising it above her head with arms that shouldn't have been able to lift a standard combat pack. The weapon, which contained the compressed mass of a small moon, rose as if it weighed nothing at all. The hall erupted in chaos. Instructors shouted for scanning equipment. Cadets stumbled backward, their understanding of physics temporarily shattered. Ellis stared, his enhanced mind racing through impossibilities, landing finally on a truth that everyone had forgotten. Baseline humans weren't weaker than their augmented descendants. They were different. Raya held the blade steady, her muscles not straining but adapting. Her baseline human biology doing what millions of years of evolution had designed it to do, finding ways to survive impossible situations through sheer, stubborn refusal to acknowledge limitation. Humans, she said quietly, though her voice carried through the silent hall, were the only species that went from caves to spaceflight without augmentation. We climbed out of our gravity well with nothing but baseline bodies and determination. She lowered the blade carefully, setting it back on its pedestal. We didn't get stronger, we just forgot that we were never weak. The Academy record books would show that Raya Chen lifted the blade of Zarian with unaugmented human strength. But that wasn't the whole truth. She'd lifted it with something the galaxy had nearly forgotten in its rush toward enhancement and evolution, the original human spirit, forged in Earth's gravity, tested by millennia of surviving when survival seemed impossible. Ellis approached her after, his augmented perfection somehow seeming less impressive than it had before. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "You could, because everyone needed to see it for themselves," Raya interrupted. "Needed to remember that humanity didn't conquer the stars because we became something else." She looked at him with those steady, unenhanced eyes. "We did it by being exactly what we are." From that day forward, the Academy's training manuals included a new section: never underestimate baseline capability. And Raya Chen, the girl they'd mocked for her weak arms, became the standard by which true strength was measured.